Over the years, there have been plenty of hated perks in Dead by Daylight for a variety of reasons. Reason 1 being that the perks were ridiculously overpowered, like Original Decisive Strike, which would effectively grant all 4 survivors a 4th life, as it didn't matter if they had been hooked previously and didn't have any tie-in with the obsession. It would always proc with no prerequisites with an almighty 5-second stun time. Or Original Metal of Man, which effectively gave survivors 3 health states for free as it stacked on regular hits instead of protection hits. Or Original Undying, which effectively gave the killer 5 ruins, 5 devour hopes, or any other hex perk they wanted. Reason 2 being that they straight up broke the game as a whole, like Original Balanced Landing, which straight up made survivors unkillable on certain maps, or Old Dead Hard, which, aside from being incredibly strong, also allowed survivors to glitch into God mode spots on certain maps. Or reason 3, they were simply annoying, like Franklin's Demise, or I'm sure you could name a few yourself. Now of course, many of these perks did end up getting changed, whether it was absolutely needed like Original Decisive Strike, or somewhat questionable like some of Self-Care's nerfs. But the reason for most, if not all of these changes can be boiled down to them being either far too overpowered, too frustrating, or having a tremendously high pick rate. However, there is one single perk that stands out from the crowd. One perk that transcends the hatred of us mere mortal players and went so far as to frustrate the developers themselves, and that was none other than the original version of Tinkerer. At first thought, it may seem bizarre for Tinkerer of all perks to cause issues for the devs. It's a fairly simple perk really, not too OP, not too weak, and I mostly only ever see Tinkerer on bubbers trying to secure some cheeky surprise chainsaws. To be fair, it was sometimes irritating to play against back when it could proc infinite times on every gen, but fixing that was hardly the hardest thing the devs have ever done. So how did Tinkerer cause issues for behaviour? Well, Tinkerer as you know it today is very different to how it used to be. The perk hasn't just had numerous buffs and nerfs over the years, and instead got completely reworked, with the current version sharing absolutely zero similarities with the old one other than name. So what exactly did old Tinkerer do? Well, for starters, it had absolutely no interaction with generators or terror radius. Instead, its function was this. Add-ons that affect the charge time of your power are 15% more effective. Well, after 6 months it got nerfed down to 10%, but the effects would change from multiplicative to additive, which actually meant that it was a huge buff. So instead of increasing an add-on's effectiveness by 10% of its original value, it just straight up adds an additional 10% to that value, which is where it remained until its eventual rework. Now, a perk dedicated to simply buffing your add-ons sounds actually quite nice on paper, but unfortunately old Tinkerer was nowhere near as interesting as you'd think, most likely due to it only affecting charge time add-ons, which were some of the most boring add-ons available. Want to amplify the effects of Dead Rabbit to get an even smaller terror radius on Michael Myers? Sorry, no dice. Want to amplify the effects of Deerskin Gloves to reload even faster as Huntress? Nope, not allowed. Want to amplify the effects of the Insta-Rev add-ons to be even instanter? Go crazy, rev as fast as you like. And that marks the beginning of Tinkerer's problems, as the only add-ons it was designed to work on were some of the community's least favourite ones. Whether you're a veteran player or still fairly new, I'm sure you've heard of people talking about old Insta-Rev on Billy, which was basically the only controversial part of pre-nerf Billy. Speaking of which, halfway through making this video, the devs announced that they will be turning Billy's overheat into a feature that empowers him instead of punishing him, finally. What the controversial Insta-Rev combo did was severely reduce the amount of time it took Billy to begin chainsawing, and in turn removed a decent chunk of counterplay for survivors where they would have previously been able to reach a pallet or window if Billy had default charge speed. But with Insta-Rev, his chainsaw would start too quickly and it would result in downs that felt pretty unfair. And what do you know, that was the only combo that Tinkerer was designed to work on, making that frustrating and hated combo even stronger. This also applied to Bubba, who originally shared 100% of Billy's add-ons, alongside Huntress with her Insta Wind-Up combo too, which was also hated as it too removed a big window of counterplay for survivors. Also keep in mind that the Huntress's Insta Wind-Up combo, which I'll also call Insta-Rev as it's easier to say, used to be even faster than it it is now, as Mana Grass Braid used to be 10% faster instead of today's 8%, and Flower Babushka was a whopping 20% faster. With those already high numbers being amplified by a further 10% with Tinkerer, Insta-Rev on any character became incredibly oppressive. I'd argue that Insta-Rev and Tinkerer were far more oppressive on Huntress than Billy and Bubba, but it wasn't talked about as much because people were far more concerned with iridescent heads, which was absolutely bonkers with how OP it used to be, which I'll save for another video. I've been saying designed to work on because the perk description explicitly stated it specifically worked on charge time add-ons, but that wasn't strictly true. For instance, Tinkerer not only affected Trapper's faster trap setting add-ons, but also strong coil spring and 4 coil spring kit, which had nothing to do with charge speed and instead made it take longer for survivors to disarm and sabotage his traps. These weird inconsistencies were not exclusive to the Trapper, far from it in fact. While some add-ons specifically had a line in their description stating affected by Tinkerer, it really wasn't as simple as that, because there were plenty more add-ons that had no official mention of working with Tinkerer, yet they still did. For example, the aforementioned Insta-Rev Huntress. That's right, Mana Grass Braid and Flower Babushka were not supposed to have any interaction with Tinkerer whatsoever. In fact, the last killer that officially supported Tinkerer was the Doctor, with it further increasing the passive madness gain for survivors in his terror radius when using add-ons that had that effect. If you don't understand what I mean by that, don't worry, it's to do with his old pre-rework kit, which I'll also cover in a future video. Another example would be the Pig, where some of her add-ons that affected the charge time of her dash also worked with Tinkerer, even though they weren't supposed to according to their description. This is likely related to the notorious code recycling the Pig had, where in development they duplicated the Huntress and used her as the base for the Pig while developing her, which is likely why Tinkerer affected the Pig's add-ons too, as they shared the Huntress's code. That being said, I'm sure you all have one question in mind. Why was the Doctor the last killer developed with Tinkerer in mind? Was Tinkerer's rework right around the corner, so they figured there's no point working around it when it's about to be changed anyway? Nope, it took a little while for Tinkerer to get changed. So why did they abandon it then? Well, it turns out that Tinkerer added a lot more development time for each killer release, and the sheer amount of time and iterating it took to keep this perk supported just wasn't worth it to them. The main reason was said to be balance, as they had to find an incredibly sweet spot where an add-on would still be impactful at its base value, but not overpowered when you add a flat 10% on top of it, which was kind of an impossible task in my opinion. In a lot of instances, a difference of 5% can make or break an add-on, let alone 10%. For instance, imagine if Clown's Bleach add-on made survivors 9% slower instead of the current day 4%. That would be nuts, let alone 14%. Well, you don't need to imagine. Tinkerer and Insta-Rev on Huntress, Billy and Bubba was all the proof you needed. Outside of balancing, each add-on would have to have Tinkerer's effects manually added into its code. Keep in mind, it wasn't something as simple as any add-on with a percent effect has its percentage increased. They specifically only wanted add-ons that affect charge time to be enabled, so Tinkerer couldn't just have a blanket check for whether or not an add-on is percentage based. They instead had to pick and select each one by hand, unless they were copying and pasting the add-ons and having the code for Tinkerer carry over by accident, which alone meant doing another pass on their add-ons. They had to actually make all of the killer's add-ons, then pick and choose which one's effects were worthy of having Tinkerer, then go through and balance all the add-ons, which took significantly longer on any of the ones that were integrated with Tinkerer, so I can definitely understand why they decided Tinkerer just wasn't worth keeping around. So if the Doctor was the last killer to be developed with Tinkerer in mind, that means Tinkerer was abandoned only 11 months after Dead by Daylight's release, not quite making the 1 year mark. I mentioned that it took a little while for Tinkerer to eventually get reworked. So just how long did it take? 1 entire year. Well, the perk was abandoned after 11 months, so its rework basically only took 1 month, which is actually pretty good. Wrong! It was an entire year after it was abandoned before it was finally reworked. So technically, it took 2 entire years for Tinkerer to get reworked, officially supported for 11 months, abandoned for 13. So in update 2.1.0, on the 24th of July 2018, Tinkerer would finally be reworked into the perk you're familiar with today, albeit slightly different to today's balance, with the perk activating when a gen reaches 85% completion instead of today's 70%, giving killers less of a chance to interrupt the gen's completion, particularly when multiple survivors were working on the gen together, alongside the perk being free to reproc an infinite number of times on every gen. Original Tinkerer was perhaps the biggest burden to the dev team that we've ever seen from a perk. Ultimately, the complete rework of the perk was completely justified, as it added an unreasonable amount of extra work and dev time and pushed some of the most frustrating add-on combos to the extreme. That being said, I would love for something similar to come back into the game. Remove the restriction of it only working on add-ons that affect ability charge time and instead make it work on any add-on that has a percentage effect. And instead of making it a 10% additive bonus, perhaps try making it a 25% multiplicative bonus, or whatever number would be balanced. Then throw it into the public test build and see if it's fair or not. I know it may sound absolutely wild at first thought, but a lot of the problem combos like Insta-Rev Billy and Bubba are gone now, and occupying a perk slot is a pretty big sacrifice, so the benefits should be justified. Lastly, by changing it from an additive bonus to a multiplicative bonus, it would affect all add-ons equally. For instance, a 25% bonus speed add-on with Tinkerer granting a 10% bonus would come to 35% if it were additive like it used to be, or 27.5% if it were multiplicative, which is much fairer, but would of course need a higher bonus than 10% for it to be valuable.